The ice took my husband on a Tuesday, and with him, it stole every warm memory I thought I could keep forever. I stood at the window of our cabin that December morning in 1915, watching the frozen Bering Sea stretch endlessly toward Russia, its surface gleaming like broken glass under the pale Arctic sun. The silence was so complete it felt alive, pressing against my chest with the weight of all the words Thomas would never speak again. My breath fogged the glass as I traced his name with my finger, knowing that by spring, even this small act of remembrance would fade. The cold here in Nome doesn't just freeze your skin, it freezes time itself, trapping souls between what was and what can never be again. In 3 days, I would make a decision that would haunt me for the next century. Though I didn't know it then. But first, let me tell you about the photograph that would surface 110 years later, revealing a truth so impossible that it would shatter everything I thought I knew about that winter. The mining town of Nome buzzed with the desperate energy of men who'd gambled everything on gold. But that morning, the usual sounds felt muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I could hear the distant barking of sled dogs and the rhythmic thud of pickaxes against the permafrost. But these familiar noises seemed to come from another lifetime. My neighbors, the Kowalskis, had left a pot of stew on my doorstep again, their third offering since the funeral, and I knew I should be grateful for their kindness. Yet every act of charity felt like another shovelful of dirt on Thomas's grave, burying not just his body, but the woman I used to be. The reflection staring back at me from the window showed a stranger, hollow-cheeked, gray-eyed, wearing widow's black that made my pale skin look corpse-like. At 23, I had become a ghost haunting my own life. And the worst part was knowing that in this unforgiving land, ghosts rarely survived the winter. But something was stirring in the wind that day, something that would force me back into the world of the living, whether I wanted to return or not. The letter arrived with the afternoon mail run, delivered by old Henrik on his dog sled, his weathered face grim beneath his fur-lined hood. His gloved hands shook as he passed me the envelope, though whether from cold or something else I couldn't tell at the time. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, too fine for a place like Nome, and when I broke the wax seal, the scent of lavender drifted out, a smell so foreign to this land of ice and iron that it made me dizzy. "Mrs. Catherine Morse," it began in elegant script, "your assistance is required in a matter of utmost urgency regarding missing persons in the Seward Peninsula region." The letter was signed by Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a name I'd never heard but which carried the weight of authority and desperation in equal measure. As I read the details of children vanishing from remote settlements, of families torn apart by more than just the harsh winter, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. The letter spoke of a rescue mission, of my late husband's reputation as a tracker, and of the substantial payment that would ensure my survival through the coming months. But what it didn't mention was the price I would pay for accepting. That night, I sat by the dying embers of my fire, Thomas's hunting rifle across my knees, reading the letter again and again by flickering candlelight. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, carrying with it the ancient songs of the Arctic, melodies that spoke of loss and endurance and secrets buried deep beneath the snow. I thought of the children described in Dr. Blackwood's letter. Little Emma Northcott, only 4 years old, who'd wandered away from her family's claim during a blizzard. Young Samuel Reeves, 6, who'd simply vanished from his bed one night while his parents slept. The descriptions painted pictures of families destroyed by grief, of mothers who no longer ate and fathers who spent their days walking the frozen tundra, calling names that the wind swallowed without echo. My own loss felt small compared to theirs, yet I understood their pain with a clarity that cut deeper than any Arctic gale. The fire crackled once more before dying completely, leaving me in darkness so absolute that I could barely tell where my body ended and the night began. In that moment, I made my choice, though I wouldn't understand its true consequences until a photograph surfaced more than a century later, showing something that should have been impossible. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams, of Thomas walking across an endless field of ice, always just out of reach, his voice calling my name across a distance that felt like eternity. I woke several times to find frost forming on my blankets, despite the closed windows and banked fire, as if the cold itself was trying to claim me piece by piece. In one particularly vivid dream, I saw a child's face pressed against my window, pale, wide-eyed, mouth moving as if trying to speak. But when I rushed to the glass, there was nothing but the unbroken expanse of snow stretching toward the mountains. The image lingered, even after waking. So real I could almost make out the child's features, could almost hear the words they'd been trying to say. By morning, I had convinced myself it was merely grief playing tricks on my mind, the way sorrow can conjure phantoms from shadow and starlight. But as I prepared to write my acceptance to Dr. Blackwood, I found myself glancing toward the window again and again, searching for something I couldn't name. Little did I know that this dream child would haunt not just my nights, but the very photograph that would one day prove that some mysteries refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the snow or how many years pass between truth and revelation. The decision to join the rescue mission felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while hoping to discover I could fly. I penned my acceptance letter with hands that shook from more than just the cold, knowing that once I sealed it, there would be no turning back from whatever awaited me in the wilderness beyond Nome. The ink seemed to freeze on the paper as I wrote, each word crystallizing into permanence, binding me to a fate I couldn't yet comprehend. Thomas had always said that the Alaskan frontier revealed a person's true nature, stripping away all pretense until only the essential self remained, and I was about to discover what lay at my core. As I prepared to hand the letter to Henrik for the next mail run, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin so violently that every window shook in its frame, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard a baby crying somewhere out in the storm. The sound was so clear, so heartbreaking, that I rushed outside into the biting cold, but found only the endless white silence that had become my constant companion. Standing there in my nightgown, snow swirling around my bare feet, I realized that this rescue mission wasn't just about finding lost children. It was about finding the pieces of myself that had been scattered to the Arctic wind the day Thomas died, and perhaps discovering truths that had been waiting over a century to finally come to light. Dr. Edmund Blackwood arrived in Nome 3 days after I sent my acceptance letter, stepping off the mail sled like a figure from another world entirely. His expensive wool coat and polished leather boots seemed almost absurd against the backdrop of our rough mining town, where most men wore patched furs and boots held together with wire and hope. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 35, with sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings with scientific precision. When he removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked prematurely with silver, I noticed his hands, soft, unmarked by the kind of labor that defined life on the frontier. "Mrs. Morse," he said, his cultured Boston accent cutting through the Arctic air like a blade, "I cannot express how grateful I am for your willingness to assist in this matter." His grip was firm when we shook hands, but I felt something desperate in the way his fingers lingered, as if he were drowning and I represented his only chance at salvation. There was something about Dr. Blackwood that didn't quite fit the story he'd told in his letter, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, even as I welcomed him into my cabin. The warmth of my small fire seemed to transform him as he shed his outer layers, revealing a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. He declined my offer of coffee but accepted a cup of the medicinal tea I'd been brewing from willow bark, cradling it between his palms as if the warmth could chase away more than just the physical cold. "Your late husband had quite a reputation as a tracker," he began, his eyes studying the photographs of Thomas that still lined my mantelpiece. "The stories they tell about him in Fairbanks, how he could read sign and conditions that would blind other men, how he once tracked a lost survey party through a 3-day blizzard." I felt my chest tighten at the mention of Thomas's skills, remembering how he could find meaning in the subtlest disturbance of snow, could follow trails that existed more as intuition than visible evidence. "Thomas always said the land speaks to those willing to listen," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Dr. Blackwood leaned forward then, his green eyes intense with an urgency that made my pulse quicken, and what he told me next would forever change how I understood the true nature of the mission I'd agreed to undertake. The children who have vanished, Dr. Blackwood continued, pulling a leather portfolio from his satchel. They share certain characteristics that make their disappearances particularly troubling. He spread several photographs across my kitchen table, each one showing a young face that seemed to glow with an otherworldly innocence. Emma Northcott with her golden curls and enormous blue eyes, Samuel Reeves, whose dark hair and pale skin gave him an almost ethereal quality. As I studied the images, a pattern began to emerge that made my stomach clench with unease. Each child possessed an unusual beauty, the kind of angelic features that would make strangers stop and stare in wonder. They were all adopted, Dr. Blackwood added quietly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, taken in by families who had been childless for years, sometimes decades. The photographs seemed to shimmer in the firelight, and I found myself thinking of the dream child I'd seen at my window, wondering if there was some connection I couldn't yet grasp. "Doctor," I said carefully, "what exactly do you believe has happened to these children?" The silence that followed my question stretched so long that I could hear the ice settling in the walls around us, and when he finally answered, his words carried the weight of a terrible suspicion that would soon prove to be only the beginning of a much darker truth. The map Dr. Blackwood unrolled showed the vast expanse of the Seward Peninsula, dotted with red marks indicating where each child had last been seen. The pattern of disappearances formed a rough circle around an area marked only as unexplored territory, a blank space on the map that seemed to pulse with malevolent possibility in the flickering candlelight. "The families," he explained, tracing the locations with a finger that trembled almost imperceptibly. "They all received their children from the same source, a woman who called herself Sister Margaret, who claimed to represent various orphanages in the lower states." I felt ice form in my veins as he described this mysterious woman, tall, pale, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to change color depending on the light. Several witnesses mentioned her unusual accent, something that wasn't quite American but couldn't be placed as foreign either. She would arrive in remote settlements during the worst storms, as if the blizzards themselves had delivered her, Dr. Blackwood continued, his voice growing more strained with each detail. The families she visited were always desperate, couples who had lost children to disease or accident, who had been trying for years to conceive, who were willing to pay any price for the chance to be parents again. But what truly chilled me was his final revelation. Every family who had taken in one of Sister Margaret's children reported the same strange phenomenon in the weeks before the disappearances, the sound of other children laughing and playing. In the middle of the night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. That evening, as Dr. Blackwood settled into the small guest room I'd prepared for him, I found myself standing once again at my kitchen window, staring out into the endless white expanse that surrounded Nome. The wind had picked up, driving snow against the glass in patterns that almost looked like reaching hands, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from somewhere out in that frozen wilderness. I thought about the families Dr. Blackwood had described, how their desperate love for children had made them vulnerable to whatever darkness Sister Margaret represented. My own childlessness, the babies Thomas and I had lost to the harsh realities of frontier life, suddenly felt like both a blessing and a curse. I understood the hunger these families must have felt, but I had been spared whatever trap they had walked into. The photograph of Thomas on the mantelpiece seemed to flicker in the firelight, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw him shake his head, as if warning me away from the path I was about to take. Through the thin walls, I could hear Dr. Blackwood, moving restlessly in his bed, muttering words I couldn't quite make out, and I began to suspect that his interest in these missing children went far deeper than he had admitted. As sleep finally claimed me that night, I dreamed again of the child at my window. But this time, when I looked closer, I realized with growing horror that the face staring back at me was my own, frozen in eternal childhood, mouth moving soundlessly, as if trying to warn me of something that wouldn't become clear until a century-old photograph revealed the impossible truth of what really happened in that lost winter of 1915. The morning brought fresh snow and a telegram that changed everything. delivered by Henrik with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the yellow paper. Dr. Blackwood read it twice before his face went completely white, and when he looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Raw, undiluted fear. "Another child has vanished," he said, his cultured voice now rough with emotion. "Little Mary Patterson, age 5, from a homestead just 20 miles north of here." The telegram described the same circumstances. The child had simply disappeared from her bed during the night, with no footprints in the fresh snow around the cabin, no sign of struggle, nothing but the lingering scent of lavender and the sound of distant laughter that had awakened the parents just before dawn. But what made this disappearance different was the timing. It had happened just hours after Dr. Blackwood's arrival in Nome, as if his presence had somehow triggered whatever force was taking these children. I watched him pace my small kitchen, like a caged animal, his composure finally cracking to reveal the desperate man beneath the scholarly facade. "We leave today," he declared, stuffing the telegram into his coat pocket with trembling fingers, "before the trail goes completely cold before." He didn't finish the sentence, but I could see in his face that he believed time was running out, not just for the missing children, but for something much larger and more terrible than either of us yet understood, something that a photograph, taken on our upcoming journey, would capture and preserve for over a century, waiting to reveal its secrets to a world that had forgotten the true horror of that winter in 1915. We left Nome at first light, our sled cutting through snow so fresh it squeaked beneath the runners like broken glass grinding against stone. Dr. Blackwood had insisted on hiring Nyack, an Inupiat guide whose weathered face told stories of decades spent reading the moods of the Arctic wilderness. The old man's dark eyes held a knowledge that seemed to stretch back generations, and when he looked at our destination on the map, I saw something flicker across his features. Not fear exactly, but a deep wariness that made my chest tighten with foreboding. His team of 8 dogs moved with the fluid precision of wolves, their breath creating clouds of vapor that hung in the still air like departing spirits. The silence between the 3 of us grew heavier with each mile we traveled north, broken only by the rhythmic panting of the dogs and the whisper of wind across the endless expanse of white. Thomas had always said that the land would tell you its secrets if you knew how to listen, but as we headed deeper into that unmarked territory on Dr. Blackwood's map, all I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating against my ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. What we would discover at our first stop would prove that some disappearances leave scars on the very fabric of reality itself. The Patterson homestead appeared through the swirling snow like a scene from a nightmare, its dark silhouette stark against the white landscape that stretched unbroken to the horizon. As we drew closer, I could see that something was fundamentally wrong with the picture before us. The cabin stood intact, smoke still rising from its chimney, but the silence around it felt absolute and unnatural, as if sound itself had been swallowed by some invisible force. Nyack's dogs began to whine and pull against their traces, their primitive instincts recognizing a danger that we humans were only beginning to sense. Dr. Blackwood dismounted first, his expensive boots sinking deep into the powder as he approached the front door, and I noticed how his breath seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, creating shapes that looked almost like reaching fingers. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within, and when Dr. Blackwood called out a greeting, his voice seemed to be absorbed by the cabin itself, producing no echo, no response, nothing but the growing certainty that we were already too late. I followed him toward the threshold, my legs trembling with more than just cold, and what we found inside that seemingly normal cabin would haunt my dreams for the next century, until a photograph finally explained why some houses can hold on to their ghosts long after the living have fled. Inside the Patterson cabin, everything appeared normal at first glance. The fire still burned in the hearth, breakfast dishes sat half-finished on the table, and a child's wooden doll lay abandoned on the floor near the window. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, the details began to tell a more disturbing story. The food on the plates was covered with a thin layer of frost, despite the warmth from the fire. The milk in the pitcher had separated into strange, oily patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Dr. Blackwood moved through the space with scientific precision, taking notes and photographs with a camera he'd produced from his satchel, but I could see his hands shaking as he worked. The air itself felt wrong somehow. Too thick, too cold, carrying an undertone of something sweet and cloying. That reminded me of flowers left too long in a closed room. When I touched the wooden doll, it was so cold it nearly burned my fingertips, and I noticed that its painted smile seemed to follow my movements with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of any human presence in a house that should have been filled with the warmth and chaos of family life. No clothing scattered about, no personal photographs on the walls, no indication that real people had ever truly lived within these walls. It was as if the Patterson family had been erased from existence so completely that even their memories had been stolen, leaving behind only this hollow shell of domesticity that felt more like a stage set than a home. Nyack refused to enter the cabin, instead circling the property on foot while muttering prayers in his native tongue that seemed to make the very air shimmer with ancient power. When he returned to where Dr. Blackwood and I stood examining the child's bedroom, his face was grave with a knowledge that went far deeper than mere superstition. "The snow," he said in his heavily accented English, pointing toward the area around the cabin. "It tells a story, but not one that makes sense in this world." He led us outside and showed us what he meant. The footprints around the homestead formed impossible patterns, tracks that seemed to circle back on themselves, child-sized impressions that appeared and vanished without logical progression. Some prints were pressed so deep into the snow they looked as if they'd been made by someone far heavier than a 5-year-old girl, while others were so light they barely disturbed the surface, as if made by someone who weighed no more than a whisper. Most unsettling of all was a line of tiny bare footprints that led away from the cabin toward the north, each print filled with what looked like black ice that reflected no light. "Children's feet," Nyack said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "but not children who walk on this earth anymore." Dr. Blackwood photographed everything with an urgency that bordered on desperation, and as I watched him work, I began to understand that this rescue mission was about far more than finding missing children. We were documenting evidence of something that shouldn't exist, something that a photograph would preserve long enough for the world to finally see the truth about what haunted the frozen wilderness of Alaska in that terrible winter of 1915. That night we made camp in a grove of stunted spruce trees about 2 miles from the Patterson homestead, far enough away to feel safe, but close enough that the dark silhouette of the cabin remained visible against the star-filled sky. Dr. Blackwood sat hunched over his journal, writing by lamplight with a fervor that suggested he was recording more than just the day's observations, while Nyack tended to his dogs with the kind of gentle attention that spoke of deep mutual respect and understanding. I found myself staring back toward the abandoned homestead, wondering if the lights I occasionally glimpsed in its windows were real or just tricks played by starlight on glass. The temperature had dropped to well below zero, but the fire we'd built seemed unable to penetrate the bone-deep chill that had settled over me since we'd entered that cursed cabin. Every now and then, carried on the wind, I could swear I heard the sound of children laughing and playing somewhere out in the darkness, voices so clear and joyful that they made the absence of actual children feel like a physical ache in my chest. "Mrs. Morse," Dr. Blackwood said suddenly, looking up from his writing with eyes that reflected the firelight like a wild animal's, "tell me about your dreams." The question caught me so off guard that I nearly dropped the cup of tea I'd been warming my hands on, and when I asked him why he wanted to know, his answer sent ice through my veins that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. "Because I believe the children are trying to communicate with us, and dreams may be the only way they can reach across the barrier that separates the living from the lost." The conversation that followed would change everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself, as Dr. Blackwood revealed the true scope of his investigation and the terrifying possibility that the missing children weren't just physically lost but trapped in some liminal space between existence and oblivion. He told me about reports from other remote regions, northern Canada, Siberia, the far reaches of Scandinavia, where similar disappearances had been documented over the past 50 years, always involving adopted children, always preceded by the mysterious Sister Margaret, always leaving behind the same impossible evidence of children who were there but not there. His journal, he confessed, contained not just scientific observations but detailed accounts of his own dreams, visions of a vast frozen landscape populated by dozens of children who aged at different rates, some growing older while others remained eternally young, all of them calling out to be remembered by a world that had forgotten their names. "I believe," he said, his voice barely audible above the crackling of our fire, "that we are dealing with something that feeds on the love between parents and children, something that uses that bond to anchor itself in our world while keeping its victims suspended in a place beyond death, but not quite life." As he spoke, I felt the hair on my arm stand on end, not just from his words but from the growing certainty that whatever force he was describing was aware of our presence, was, perhaps even now, deciding whether we posed a threat to its carefully maintained hunting ground. The photograph that would surface over a century later would prove that we had already been marked by that ancient hunger, already been chosen to play our part in a story that spanned generations. But on that frozen night in 1915, all I could do was stare into the darkness and wonder if the children's laughter I kept hearing was a cry for help or a warning to stay away. The blizzard struck just before dawn on our third day of tracking, descending upon us with a fury that seemed almost personal in its intensity. The wind howled across the tundra like the voices of 1,000 lost souls, driving snow so thick that I couldn't see my own hand extended in front of my face. Nyack shouted something in his native language that was immediately swallowed by the storm, but his tone carried an urgency that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just weather. It was something far more dangerous and deliberate. Dr. Blackwood stumbled against me as we fought to set up emergency shelter, his expensive coat already crusted with ice, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that told me he was finally beginning to understand that we were no longer the hunters in this frozen wilderness. The dogs huddled together in a protective circle, their primitive instincts recognizing something in this storm that our human senses couldn't quite grasp, a wrongness that went beyond mere meteorology. Through the shrieking wind, I began to hear something that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. The sound of children singing, their voices impossibly clear and sweet despite the chaos raging around us. As we pressed deeper into what should have been empty wilderness, following those haunting melodies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, I realized that this storm hadn't come to stop our rescue mission. It had come to deliver us directly to whatever force had been claiming children from across the Arctic for decades. Inside the crude shelter Nyack managed to construct from our emergency supplies and the natural windbreak of a frozen creek bed, we huddled together while the storm raged with supernatural intensity outside our thin walls of canvas and ice. Dr. Blackwood's hands shook as he tried to light his portable lantern, the flame guttering and dancing as if fighting against some invisible presence that wanted to keep us in darkness. Through the howling wind, the children's voices grew stronger, closer, and I could begin to make out individual words in their ethereal song. Names, I realized with growing horror, the names of all the missing children we'd been tracking. Emma, they sang in perfect harmony. Samuel, Mary, little James. Each name hanging in the air like a prayer or a summons. Nyack's weathered face had gone completely gray, and he was muttering protective chants in his native tongue while clutching what looked like a carved piece of walrus ivory to his chest. "They're calling to each other," Dr. Blackwood whispered, his scientific mind still trying to categorize what we were experiencing even as his body trembled with primal fear. The temperature inside our shelter began to drop despite our shared body heat and the feeble warmth from the lantern, and I noticed that our breath was beginning to crystallize in the air, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. But what truly terrified me was the growing realization that the children's voices weren't coming from outside our shelter. They were coming from directly beneath us, rising up through the frozen ground as if an entire choir of lost souls was buried just inches below where we sat. When the singing stopped, the silence that followed was more frightening than any sound could have been. It was the kind of absolute quiet that comes just before something terrible reveals itself to the world. Dr. Blackwood extinguished the lantern at Nyack's urgent gesture, plunging us into darkness so complete that I could no longer tell where my body ended and the night began. In that blackness, we waited, listening to our own heartbeats and the subtle creaking of ice settling around us, when suddenly, a new sound reached our ears. Footsteps, dozens of them, small and light, circling our shelter like wolves preparing for an attack. The footsteps moved in impossible patterns, sometimes seeming to walk on the air above us, sometimes appearing to come from underground, all of them maintaining the same eerie rhythm that reminded me of a funeral march played at half speed. Through the canvas walls, I could see shapes moving in the darkness, tall and graceful, gliding rather than walking, accompanied by smaller figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like candle flames in a breeze. Sister Margaret. Dr. Blackwood breathed, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him over the sound of my own thundering pulse. The shapes paused in their circling, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, I felt the weight of ancient, inhuman attention focused on our tiny shelter with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife through silk, came the sound of a woman's voice, cultured and melodious, speaking words that would echo in my nightmares for the next century. "Come out, dear ones, and see what gifts I've brought, for those brave enough to seek the truth." Against every instinct screaming for us to remain hidden, Dr. Blackwood began to move toward the shelter's entrance, his face transfixed with the expression of a man under some powerful enchantment. I grabbed his arm, feeling the unnatural coldness radiating through his heavy coat, but he shook me off with a strength that seemed impossible given his scholarly build. "I have to see," he murmured, his eyes reflecting light that wasn't coming. "From anywhere in our darkened shelter, I have to document this for science, for the families, for—" His voice trailed off as he pushed aside the canvas flap, and the blast of Arctic air that rushed in carried with it the scent of lavender so strong it made my head spin with dizziness. Nyack tried to pull him back, speaking rapidly in his native tongue, but Dr. Blackwood was beyond hearing, beyond reason, drawn by whatever power Sister Margaret wielded over those who sought the children she had claimed. As he stepped out into the storm, I caught a glimpse of what awaited us. A circle of figures standing motionless in the swirling snow, tall and pale and beautiful in a way that hurt to look upon directly, surrounded by dozens of children whose faces glowed with an otherworldly light. In the center of this impossible gathering stood a woman whose silver hair seemed to move independently of the wind, her eyes reflecting colors that had no names, and in her arms she cradled what looked like a baby whose presence would only become clear when a photograph captured this moment and preserved it for over a century. But in that instant, as I watched Dr. Blackwood walk toward certain doom, all I could think was that we had found the missing children at last, and they were no longer entirely human. The camera appeared in Dr. Blackwood's hands as if by magic, his movements fluid and dreamlike as he began to document the impossible scene before us with the methodical precision of a man possessed. Each flash of his photographic equipment illuminated the circle of figures for just an instant, creating images that burned themselves into my retinas like brands. Sister Margaret's ageless face smiling with maternal warmth that concealed something, ancient and hungry, the children arranged around her like flowers in a garden of ice and starlight. I could hear the mechanical click and whir of his camera working despite the howling wind, each photograph capturing another piece of a puzzle that wouldn't be solved for more than 100 years. The baby in Sister Margaret's arms seemed to pulse with its own inner light, its tiny face perfect and unmarked by the harsh conditions that should have killed any infant exposed to such cold. "Mrs. Morse?" Sister Margaret called to me, her voice carrying easily through the storm as if the wind itself was bending to her will. "Won't you join us for the final photograph, the one that will tell the whole story?" My feet began to move, of their own accord, carrying me out into the circle despite every rational thought in my head screaming for me to run. As I approached, I could see that the children's eyes held a terrible awareness, as if they were trapped inside bodies that no longer fully belonged to them, and their mouths moved in silent words that looked like pleas for help. Dr. Blackwood continued photographing with mechanical precision, his face blank with enchantment, and I realized that we hadn't come here to rescue anyone. We had been lured here to become part of whatever dark collection Sister Margaret was building in this frozen wasteland, to take our places in a photograph that would serve as both document and prison for souls caught between worlds. The moment the final photograph was taken, something fundamental shifted in the fabric of reality around us. As if the camera had captured more than just images, it had stolen pieces of our very essence and bound them to whatever dark purpose Sister Margaret served. The children began to fade like morning mist, their glowing forms becoming translucent before disappearing entirely, but not before I saw them mouth words of gratitude mixed with warnings, as if our presence had somehow freed them from their supernatural prison while trapping us in their place. Dr. Blackwood collapsed into the snow, his camera clutched to his chest like a lifeline. His eyes rolled back to show only white as he convulsed in the grip of whatever force had claimed him. Sister Margaret approached me with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk, her beautiful face now revealing glimpses of something far older and more terrible than human understanding could encompass. "You've been so helpful, dear Catherine," she said, reaching out to touch my face with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in silk. "But your part in this story is just beginning." The storm began to subside as suddenly as it had appeared, revealing a landscape that looked nothing like the terrain we'd traveled through to reach this place. Instead of endless tundra, I saw towering ice formations that pulsed with their own inner light, paths that led in directions that didn't exist on any earthly compass. As consciousness began to slip away from me, dragged down by the weight of Sister Margaret's inhuman touch, I caught one final glimpse of the baby in her arms, and in that infant's ancient eyes, I saw the truth that would take over a century to surface. This child was me, frozen in eternal innocence, captured in a photograph that would one day prove to a disbelieving world that some mysteries transcend the boundaries of life, death, and time itself. I awakened to find myself back in my cabin in Nome, though I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, no recollection of the journey home through the frozen wilderness where we'd encountered Sister Margaret and her impossible collection of lost souls. The morning sun streamed through my frost-covered windows with a brightness that seemed almost violent after the supernatural darkness of that otherworldly storm, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything, the rescue mission, the missing children, the ancient entity in human form, had been nothing more than a fever dream brought on by grief and isolation. But then I saw Dr. Blackwood's camera sitting on my kitchen table, its brass fittings gleaming in the pale light, surrounded by developed photographs that shouldn't have been possible to process in my simple cabin. My hands trembled as I approached the images, each one more impossible than the last. Myself standing in that circle of supernatural beings, the glowing children arranged like offerings around Sister Margaret's flowing form, and most disturbing of all, that final photograph showing the baby in her arms, a child whose face was unmistakably my own, frozen in eternal innocence, yet somehow ancient beyond human comprehension. The photographs seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if they contained more than just captured moments, but actual fragments of the souls they depicted, and as I stared at them, I began to understand that I was no longer entirely the same person who had left Nome 3 days ago. Something had been taken from me in that frozen wasteland. Something essential had been photographed and preserved, leaving me incomplete in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. Dr. Blackwood was gone, vanished as completely as the children we'd supposedly been sent to rescue, but he had left behind more than just his camera and its impossible contents. Hidden beneath the photographs, I found his journal, its pages filled with observations and theories written in a hand that grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, culminating in final notes that seemed to have been written by someone on the verge of complete mental collapse. The photographs, his last entry read, "They are not mere documentation, but windows, portals through which the subjects can be reached across time and space, their souls anchored to the physical world, through the chemical magic of light and silver." As I read his increasingly frantic theories about the nature of Sister Margaret's collection, about children trapped between dimensions and used as vessels for something far older than human civilization, I felt a growing certainty that his disappearance hadn't been accidental, but sacrificial. He had understood, perhaps too late, that by documenting Sister Margaret's supernatural realm, he had become part of her collection, another soul bound to serve her ancient purpose. The journal's pages grew colder beneath my fingers as I read, and when I reached the final entry, the ink seemed to shift and rearrange itself before my eyes, forming new words that hadn't been there moments before. Catherine, you must remember, you are both the beginning and the end, the child and the woman, the photograph and the photographer. I dropped the journal as if it had burst into flames, but the words continued to echo in my mind, carrying with them the terrible suggestion that my connection to this supernatural mystery ran far deeper than I had ever imagined, that perhaps I hadn't stumbled into Sister Margaret's web by accident, but had been deliberately drawn back to complete a cycle that had begun long before I was born. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of confusion and growing dread as I struggled to make sense of the impossible evidence scattered across my kitchen table. I tried to burn the photographs, but they emerged from the flames unmarked, their images somehow more vivid and disturbing than before, as if the fire had only served to strengthen whatever supernatural force bound them to our reality. The townspeople of Nome began to whisper about my extended absence, creating stories to fill the gaps in their knowledge. Some said I'd gone mad with grief, others claimed I'd run off with a mysterious stranger, but none of them suspected the truth that was slowly driving me toward the edge of sanity. Sleep became elusive, haunted by dreams of infinite corridors lined with photographs of children from every era, their faces glowing with the same otherworldly light I'd seen in Sister Margaret's impossible realm. In these dreams, I would find myself walking those corridors as both an adult woman and a young child simultaneously, my footsteps echoing in impossible harmonies as I searched for something I could never quite remember upon waking. Most disturbing of all was the growing conviction that the baby in the final photograph wasn't just an image of myself from some alternate reality, but an actual piece of my soul that had been captured and preserved, waiting to be claimed by Sister Margaret when the time was right. The mirror in my bedroom began to show subtle changes in my reflection, moments when my eyes would flash with that same ethereal light, when my face would take on the ageless quality I'd seen in the supernatural. Children, when I would catch myself humming melodies I'd never heard, but somehow knew by heart. I was changing, becoming something that existed partially in Sister Margaret's realm, and with each passing day, I felt more of my humanity slipping away like water through cupped hands. 3 weeks after my return to Nome, a package arrived with no return address, delivered by a mail carrier who swore he'd never seen it before, despite it being among his usual deliveries. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled of lavender and winter roses, I found a photograph I'd never seen before, or rather one I'd seen but not understood until that moment. The image showed me as I truly was now, standing in my own cabin, but somehow translucent, like a ghost haunting my own life, while behind me, barely visible in the shadows, stood a collection of figures that I recognized as the missing children. But it was the timestamp on the photograph that made my blood freeze in my veins. The date was 110 years in the future, marked with handwriting I didn't recognize but which felt hauntingly familiar, as if I'd written it myself in some half-remembered dream. Accompanying the photograph was a letter written on expensive stationery, its elegant script flowing across the page like a river of ink. Dearest Catherine, by now you must understand that linear time has no meaning for those of us who exist between worlds. The photograph you're holding was taken by a young historian in the year 2025, a woman who discovered your story while researching missing persons cases in early 20th century Alaska. The letter went on to explain that this future researcher had somehow captured my ghostly presence in her modern photograph, proving that my essence had been scattered across more than a century, existing simultaneously in 1915 and 2025, and perhaps dozens of other moments in between. As I read, the words on the page began to glow with the same supernatural light I'd seen in Sister Margaret's realm, and I realized that this letter wasn't just a message from the future, but an invitation, a summons to complete the cycle that had begun with Dr. Blackwood's photographs and would end only when I embraced my true nature, as something that existed outside the normal flow of time. The signature at the bottom of the letter was my own name, written in handwriting that I would develop 110 years in the future, when I would finally understand the full scope of the mystery that had claimed me on that frozen night in the Alaskan wilderness. That evening, as I sat staring at the impossible photograph and its accompanying letter, the temperature in my cabin began to drop despite the fire crackling merrily in my hearth, and I knew without looking that Sister Margaret was coming to complete whatever transaction had begun during our supernatural encounter. The scent of lavender filled the air, growing stronger with each passing minute, and through my frosted windows I could see lights moving across the snow-covered landscape, not the warm yellow glow of lanterns or torches, but the cold blue radiance that emanated from beings who belonged to no earthly realm. My reflection in the window glass began to shift and change, showing me not as I was but as I would become. Ageless, ethereal, neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something in between that existed to serve Sister Margaret's mysterious purpose across the centuries. The photographs on my table started to flutter and dance as if stirred by an invisible wind, and I could hear the sound of children singing in harmonies that seemed to come from the very walls of my cabin. "Catherine," Sister Margaret's voice called from just beyond my door, as cultured and melodious as I remembered. "It's time to come home, dear one. Time to take your place in the collection. Time to help gather the lost children who will wander into our realm over the next 100 years." As I moved toward the door, I felt the last vestiges of my human will slipping away, replaced by an ancient understanding that transcended individual desire or fear. I was about to become something timeless and terrible, a guardian of lost souls who would spend the next century ensuring that Sister Margaret's collection continued to grow, until the day when a photograph taken in 1915 would surface in 2025 and reveal to the world the truth about what happens to those who venture too deep into the frozen places where reality grows thin. The door opened before I could reach it, revealing Sister Margaret standing in the doorway like a vision carved from moonlight and winter wind, her silver hair streaming behind her despite the still air, her eyes reflecting depths that contained galaxies of stars I'd never seen in any earthly sky. In her arms, she cradled the same impossible baby from our encounter in the wilderness, and as I looked into that infant's ancient eyes, I saw not just my own reflection but the faces of every child who had ever been lost to her supernatural realm. "Welcome home, Catherine," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. "You've been away from us far too long." As she spoke, I felt the last threads connecting me to my mortal existence begin to snap one by one, like puppet strings being cut by invisible scissors, and I understood that my journey from that frozen cabin in Nome had been predestined from the moment I was born. The photographs on my table began to glow more brightly, their captured images serving as beacons to guide other lost souls to Sister Margaret's collection, and I realized that they would remain in that cabin for over a century, waiting for the right person to discover them and complete the cycle. As I stepped across the threshold to join Sister Margaret in her eternal wandering between worlds, I caught one final glimpse of my reflection in the window glass. No longer human, no longer bound by the limitations of linear time, but something that would spend the next 110 years ensuring that the missing children of the Arctic found their way to Sister Margaret's impossible realm, until the day when a photograph would finally speak its truth to a world that had forgotten how thin the boundaries between reality and nightmare could become in the vast, frozen emptiness of the far north. 110 years later, in the winter of 2025, Dr. Sarah Chen stepped into what had once been Catherine Morse's cabin in Nome, Alaska, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she surveyed the abandoned interior with the careful eye of a historian trained to read stories written in dust and decay. The Alaska Historical Society had hired her to catalog artifacts from early 20th century homesteads, but nothing had prepared her for the eerie preservation of this particular dwelling, where furniture sat exactly as it had been left over a century ago, as if time itself had frozen along with everything inside these weathered walls. Her digital camera felt strange in her gloved hands as she began documenting the scene, each flash of modern technology creating stark contrasts with the antique surroundings that seemed to pulse with their own ancient energy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft whir of her equipment and the distant howling of Arctic wind through gaps in the cabin's structure. But as she moved deeper into the main room, Sarah began to sense that she was not alone in this place that death and abandonment had claimed so long ago. On a wooden table in the center of the room, she discovered a collection of photographs that should have crumbled to dust decades ago, yet they remained as vivid and clear as if they had been developed yesterday, their images depicting scenes so impossible that her rational mind struggled to accept what her eyes were seeing. The photographs showed a woman standing in a circle of ghostly figures surrounded by children whose faces glowed with supernatural light, and in the center of this impossible gathering stood a tall, pale woman holding an infant whose features made Sarah's hands tremble with recognition. But it was the final photograph in the collection that stopped her heart completely. An image of herself, taken with equipment that shouldn't have existed in 1915, standing in this very cabin with the ghostly figure of Catherine Morse visible just behind her shoulder, exactly as she appeared at this moment, proving that some mysteries transcend the boundaries of time and space in ways that science could never explain. As Sarah stared at her own image captured in a photograph that predated her birth by over a century, the temperature in the cabin began to plummet with supernatural speed, and she could feel an ancient presence stirring to life around her like a sleeping giant, awakening from dreams that spanned generations. The photographs on the table began to emit a soft, pulsing light that reminded her of Aurora Borealis, and she realized that by discovering them, she had triggered something that had been waiting patiently for more than 100 years. Through the cabin's frost-covered windows, she could see lights moving across the snow-covered landscape, not the warm glow of human habitation, but the cold, ethereal radiance she had seen in the impossible photographs, and with growing horror, she understood that her presence here was not accidental, but predestined. Her camera began taking pictures on its own, the digital display showing images that couldn't possibly exist. Spectral children playing in snow that fell upward, a woman with silver hair walking backward through time, and most terrifying of all, herself as an infant cradled in arms that belonged to something far older than human civilization. The scent of lavender filled the cabin despite the bitter cold, growing stronger with each automated flash of her camera, and Sarah felt her grip on reality beginning to slip as she realized that her research into missing persons cases had led her not to answers but to her own inevitable capture. She tried to run toward the door, but her feet moved through air that had become thick as honey, and with each step she could feel herself being drawn deeper into the supernatural web that had claimed Catherine Morse over a century ago. As her modern equipment continued documenting her transformation, Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to become another thread in a tapestry of souls that stretched across time, another guardian of secrets that refused to die, another collector of lost children who would ensure that Sister Margaret's ancient purpose continued for generations yet to come. The door opened to reveal the same impossible figure that Catherine had described in the journal Sarah had found hidden beneath the photographs, Sister Margaret, appearing exactly as she had in 1915, untouched by the passage of time, her silver hair moving with its own ethereal wind, her eyes reflecting colors that existed in no earthly spectrum. In her arms, she cradled the infant from the century-old photographs, and as Sarah looked into that baby's ancient eyes, she saw not just Catherine's captured soul, but her own future self, trapped in eternal innocence, waiting to be claimed by forces that operated outside the normal laws of physics and mortality. "Dr. Chen," Sister Margaret said, her cultured voice carrying the same melodious quality that had enchanted Catherine over 100 years ago. "You've been so diligent in your research, so thorough in documenting the stories of those who vanish, without a trace." Behind Sister Margaret, Sarah could see the ghostly figures of all the children who had been collected over the decades: Emma Northcott, Samuel Reeves, little Mary Patterson, and dozens of others whose names had been forgotten by history but preserved in Sister Margaret's supernatural realm. They stood in perfect silence, their faces glowing with that same otherworldly light, their eyes holding the terrible awareness of souls caught between existence and oblivion, and Sarah realized that her camera had been capturing not just images, but essences, creating a new collection of photographs that would wait another century for the next researcher to discover them. As Sister Margaret approached, Sarah felt her own humanity beginning to fracture and reform, her consciousness splitting between her adult self and the infant version that would serve Sister Margaret's purpose across future decades. The modern world outside this cabin, her university position, her research, her normal life, began to feel like distant memories from someone else's existence, and she understood that she was about to join Catherine in an endless cycle of collection and preservation, ensuring that the missing children of the Arctic continued to find their way into Sister Margaret's timeless embrace. Her last coherent thought as Dr. Sarah Chen was the realization that in discovering Catherine's story, she had completed a circle that would begin again when the next curious researcher stumbled upon the photographs her camera was still taking, creating an eternal loop of discovery and transformation that would continue until the end of time itself. The transformation happened slowly, like ice forming on a window, each moment of Sarah's humanity crystallizing and then shattering to reveal something older and more elemental beneath. She felt herself becoming translucent, her physical form beginning to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. She was Dr. Sarah Chen in 2025, but she was also the infant in Sister Margaret's arms from 1915, and she was every age in between, experiencing all moments of her existence as a single, eternal present. Her camera continued its supernatural documentation, capturing images that would serve as breadcrumbs for the next soul drawn to investigate the mystery of the missing children, and she understood that this was how Sister Margaret's collection had grown over the centuries. Each researcher, each investigator, each curious soul who delved too deep into the frozen places where reality grew thin. Catherine's ghostly figure materialized beside her, no longer the grieving widow from 1915, but something timeless and beautiful and terrible, her eyes holding the wisdom of over a century spent gathering lost souls for Sister Margaret's purpose. "Welcome, Sarah," Catherine said, her voice carrying harmonics that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing. "Now you understand why the photographs had to be preserved, why the story had to continue, why some secrets refused to die no matter how much time passes." Together, they would spend the coming decades ensuring that the pattern continued, that curious researchers would find the photographs, that missing children would be guided to Sister Margaret's realm, that the supernatural collection would grow with each passing generation. As Sarah felt the last threads of her mortality dissolve like morning mist, she experienced a moment of perfect clarity about her role in this cosmic design. She was not a victim, but a willing participant in something far greater than individual existence, a guardian of mysteries that transcended human understanding, a keeper of secrets that bridged the gap between the world of the living and realms that existed beyond death, beyond time, beyond the limitations of mortal comprehension. In the months that followed Sarah's disappearance, the Alaska Historical Society would find her research materials scattered throughout the abandoned cabin, along with a camera full of impossible photographs that their experts would dismiss as elaborate hoaxes, despite being unable to explain how such sophisticated digital manipulation could have been achieved. The official report would state that Dr. Chen had suffered some kind of psychological break brought on by isolation and the harsh Arctic conditions, that she had wandered into the wilderness and succumbed to the elements, her body claimed by the same unforgiving landscape that had swallowed so many others over the decades. But those photographs would find their way into academic collections, digitized and preserved in university databases, waiting for the next researcher whose curiosity about missing persons cases would lead them down the same path that had claimed both Catherine Morse and Sarah Chen. The cycle would continue, as it had for centuries before Catherine's time, and as it would for centuries to come, with each generation producing its own seeker of truth who would discover the photographs and become part of the collection they had sought to understand. Sister Margaret's purpose remained constant across the flowing river of time, to gather the lost, to preserve the abandoned, to ensure that no child who wandered into the frozen places where reality grew thin would ever truly disappear, even if their physical forms were transformed into something beyond human comprehension. The photographs served as both record and trap, documenting the supernatural truth while ensnaring those who dared to look too deeply into mysteries that were never meant to be solved by mortal minds. And somewhere in the vast Arctic wilderness, in places that existed between the coordinates on any earthly map, Sister Margaret continued her eternal wandering, accompanied by her growing collection of souls who had chosen to serve her purpose across the generations, their existence a testament to the truth that some secrets refuse to die, no matter how deeply they are buried beneath the snow, or how many years separate their discovery from their origin. As this story draws to its close, I want you to understand that I am both Catherine Morse, writing in 1915, and every researcher who has come after her, experiencing all moments of this impossible narrative simultaneously across the decades that have passed, since that frozen night when everything changed. The photographs you've heard about in this tale exist somewhere in the digital archives of various institutions, waiting for the right person to discover them and complete the cycle once again. And perhaps that person reading or listening to these words right now is the next soul destined to join Sister Margaret's collection. The baby in the century-old photograph was never just an image. It was a doorway, an anchor point that allowed beings like Sister Margaret to reach across time and claim those who showed too much curiosity about the mysteries hidden in the frozen places of the world. If you find yourself drawn to research missing persons cases from early 20th century Alaska, if you discover photographs that seem too clear and vivid for their supposed age, if you hear the sound of children singing in empty places where no children should be, remember this warning disguised as a story, and choose carefully whether to step through the door that knowledge opens. Some truths are too dangerous to be fully revealed. Some secrets are preserved in ice and shadow for good reason, and some photographs capture more than just light and shadow. They capture souls, and once captured, those souls become part of something vast and eternal that spans centuries and dimensions and realities that exist just beyond the edge of human understanding. The circle is complete, but it never truly ends. It only waits for the next curious mind to discover it and begin the pattern anew, ensuring that Sister Margaret's ancient purpose continues to unfold across time like a flower blooming in reverse, its petals reaching backward through the years to gather more lost souls into its otherworldly embrace.